Good afternoon, everyone. I'll call this meeting of the Assembly Transportation Committee of the Whole to order. Today is Wednesday, April 17th. We are noticed from 1 to 3 p.m. We will start with introductions, starting with Mr. Martinez.
George Martinez.
Zach Johnson. Mark Littlefield.
Karen Bronga.
Daniel Voland.
Meg Zalatel, and on the phone, Mr. Rivera.
Present.
Mr. Myers.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay. Anyone else? All right. We have a packed agenda, as always, for this quarterly meeting. Unfinished business update on local control of 5th and 6th Streets. I don't believe there is an update, so we're just going to go ahead and dive right into the new business. And we will start with our AMATS standing report. Please go ahead and introduce yourself for the record.
Thank you. I'm Aaron Yongan-Allen. I'm the MPO coordinator for AMATS. Just a real quick couple of updates here. First, our household travel survey. We recently got approval from the Assembly to move forward with that project. So we're going to finish getting the consultant on board, and we expect to start the project within the next 30 days. So be on the lookout for that. We'll also send out notices about that starting and when people can be involved in that. Next, our complete streets plan. We're finalizing negotiations with the preferred consultant, and we'll hopefully be moving forward to get that project started here pretty quickly once we get final approval from the Assembly. And then our climate action plan, we're reviewing the proposals now, and we'll be meeting as the project team to go over those proposals. So we're putting that one through the process and hope to get started in the next 3 or 4 months for that project. Outside of that, that's all I have to update you on. Thank you.
All right. Any questions? So I would invite members, if you haven't yet been, you can always attend an AMATS policy committee meeting. They're quite educational. Bring a pen and paper to write down all the acronyms you didn't understand, because learning how to speak AMATS takes a little while. But they are really good learning opportunity, and they are typically the third Thursday of the month at 1 p.m. So I think that's really the easiest way. There's also the technical advisory committee, where they really get into like super detail, and then the community advisory committee. So watching for any of those are also really helpful. I didn't know about AMATS when I joined the body for a little while until I was appointed to be on it. So I would, but it's really important stuff. All right. Thank you, Aaron. All right. We will move on to the MOA traffic standing report.
Yeah, so I'm Brad Coy, the Municipal Traffic Engineer and Director of the Traffic Engineering Department. My presentation is up on the screen, and you should also have a hard copy. So I'm going to run through that quickly. The items I'm going to touch on are the bond projects that we have upcoming, the summer roadway markings, to give an update on that, the Vision Zero program, the Protected Bike Lane pilot project status, and some international experiences our staff were recently able to participate in. First off, the traffic calming projects. We have 2 upcoming for construction in 2024. If you go to the next slide, please. The Lower Road traffic calming project is anticipated for construction this summer. It includes a raised crossing by a park. It is right at Lower Road, near where Lower Road crosses under the Seward Highway. And this one is there are some other projects that have been anticipated for Lower Road. This is one that is focused on the traffic calming element of it. There is also another raised crosswalk, on 100th Avenue in the vicinity of Bayshore Elementary. And it's also, it's a fairly narrow crossing. And so we're anticipating it being one of our least expensive raised crosswalks. So we're excited about that. So those are 2 of the traffic calming projects this summer. I should also mention we have a third that is going to be installing a permanent radar speed sign on Edward Street. The one shown here is East 6th Avenue as an example. But that one also is right in the vicinity of a school. One thing you'll notice about a few of these projects is they are in the vicinity of schools, parks, and other locations. So let's go to the next one. Our next set of projects are school zone safety projects. When projects are in the vicinity of schools, even traffic calming, they get a higher priority. So you'll see here that we have some additional school zone projects. The first one at the top there is College Gate Elementary. It's in preliminary design. It won't be ready for construction until next summer, but it includes some sidewalks, and you can see there on the map some of the things that some roadway resurface also often get incorporated into the projects, given that when you touch the sidewalk, it's amazing how much other needs that there are in that vicinity. The second one I'll touch on real quick is the Scenic Park Elementary School pedestrian improvements. This is one that Assemblymember Bronga would be familiar with. The church there right on the north side of Madeline has expressed lack of interest or desire for the project to not proceed. And so given that there was a lack of community support for this project, we actually are not proceeding at this time with it. And so sounds like questions. Should I take questions?
Are you open to taking
I am,
questions?
yeah.
You go, okay, Ms. Bronga.
I was just curious, when I saw that Edward Street speed sign, I know that there's a desire to move these funds to a different school, but Patterson could really use something like that. It's quite a mess it's a immersion school, so there's a lot of people driving their children there from other neighborhoods, and it's pretty busy on Patterson, so that might be a nice way to spend some of that money.
Okay, thank you. I know that Patterson Street is undergoing some design as a project that PM&E has. I'm not sure what the status is, but for sure, we'll make sure that as that project comes on board, that traffic calming gets considered for Patterson Street.
Mr. Martinez.
Thank you, Chair. Just to stick with that particular part of the conversation with respect to a project stopping and or potentially another project being picked up, can you describe, if you can, quickly, how does a project come to a point of potential construction and then run into community bumps in the road at that point? How does it even get that far?
That is a good question. So for this one as an example, as we were considering it back probably a year or two ago, we did reach out, we did talk with community council, and even talked with that church, and there wasn't opposition for it at that point. And so we had moved through the process, and as we were getting close to constructing it, then some of these stakeholders reached out again and wanted a new crack at it. And so we had some meetings with them, and there was clearly opposition. And so we reached out to the community council and to the school and didn't get enough of the support that we had previously gotten. And so that's how it went from about to be constructed, because it was pretty much ready to get constructed this year, to now being set aside. A few things that I'll add on that is that during when the bulk of the design and effort was ongoing, our traffic calming position was not filled, it was vacant. And so the level of our staff being able to really shepherd that through the process, do a more robust outreach effort, get in front of the community council enough times, wasn't happening. So now that we have that position filled, that outreach is happening. We're having those discussions early. So we are looking at ways, because as I look at this, we already put quite a bit of money into the design and to getting it to this far. And we can't just take any location and construct it this year, because it's got to go through that design and that process. And so the funds we've already used to design aren't going to be used, and the delay in being able to use them now comes into play. So we are looking at ways to minimize this in the future with more robust outreach early on, and integrate that into how we're doing it, how we're designing, so that ideally the ones that get moved forward this far are really rock solid with clear community support.
I thank you. I appreciate you bringing us into that process a little more. There are costs, and then I would imagine it's not as easy as to say, well, let's, like you described, we're going to just do another project with the same scope or even resources. It may be more complex than that. But I appreciate that. I think a lot of folks may not know those processes, and the more we can learn, the better. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. The next slide, if you'll go to the next one, the summer season is upon us. I know that we keep getting surprised, or maybe not surprised, with a few more inches of snow, but pretty soon we won't have snow on the ground, and it'll be time to refresh all the paint markings, which have been worn away throughout the winter. And so our paint and sign shop is going to be hard at work during the middle of the night. Fortunately, much of that time will actually be fairly light because of our daylight extending to the morning. But our shift work will begin April 29th. The staff work from 1:30 to 10 a.m., trying to do the painting when as few vehicles are on the roads as possible. And so a few words of advice: please be careful and mindful of the workers who are out there. When you see the truck up at the top, or you see staff spraying crosswalks, please exercise due caution. And also, if you see fresh paint, we encourage you not to drive over it. That is something that happens every year, unfortunately. And I do appreciate that paint and sign shop. And if you see this guy operating the equipment, also be very cautious around. He might put a yellow stripe across Mountain View Drive accidentally. That was me. So, but they let me try it out once. It was good to get a feel for what my staff are out there experiencing. Okay, next slide. Speaking of striping, I should say, markings, one of the things that we are doing at all of our road crossings in town, or at least many of them, is we're going to be installing some MMA methyl methacrylate markings, which are kind of the inlaid, more permanent, to reduce how much we have to go and actually use paint for all the railroad crossings. So that's going on this summer as well. So you'll see in the port area, and many of our crossings are getting that new material. So that's also a project you'll see this summer. Okay, go to the next one. The other item I wanted to share some excitement about is that we now are going to be restarting Vision Zero in Anchorage. It's been a couple of years. I think 2019 is the last that deliverables are being done on this. So it's been 5 years, and we're ready to pick things up. The first step is to get a Vision Zero coordinator. That position is now open. So if you know someone who wants to come work for me in my department, I'm really excited to have this position filled. We already have a list of tasks for them to work on based on the prior action plan that was completed in 2018, including outlining their work, doing a multi-agency Vision Zero working group, which I'm sure will loop in DOT in that, as well as different agencies, stakeholders, and others. We'll be working on the safe systems approach. So this is to answer Assemblymember Branga and Martinez. The safe system approach, I already have some draft policy language that I've been working on. That's being written. This really is the way to make that policy have actionable items, is through this program. So I have been hesitant to put that before the assembly yet, but once this position's up and running, that is going to be one of the first things they do. And also speed limit changes. That's something that we feel can be done. And I think the Downtown Streets Engineering Study is going to be talking about some of the vision there as well. So those are some of the policies coming out of that. And then they'll also be looking for sustainable funding sources. There's opportunities for safety money. So anyway, really excited about this. I really appreciate the efforts that went into getting this position funded and put in our department. And it's providing the capacity to do a lot of the changes. I know a lot of the community and assembly members and administration are interested in Anchorage.
So before you move on, for the record, Ms. Brawley and Mr. Constant have joined us, and they each have a question. Mr. Constant.
Thanks. So I'm excited to see a coordinator position opening for the Vision Zero program. What happened to the program over the last years? Because it's been a policy of the municipality since basically my first year on the body. What happened? Because it disappeared for a while.
So two things happened: COVID and administration change. before this position was actually in the administration. And so, as you know, as administration have many different priorities, this is one that just kind of fell off, especially as COVID happened. So those are the main two areas, which now having it within my department, it's something that really dovetails very nicely with other things that we're doing. So that looks like a more tenable future home.
Great. I just offer that 2 strikes and 1 plus, we got you. So thank you.
All right, thank you. Ms. Brawley.
Thank you, and I'm sorry I missed the first few minutes. My question is maybe around the work plan. And again, and I want to preface this by saying I'm not attempting to say in any way that we shouldn't just move forward with things in the absence of having data. But I've looked at the Vision Zero plan, and most of that data was pulled back in 2014, 2015, I think was the date of the actual data. I was involved in some of that actually, so I remember emailing with folks. So I'm just curious because I know we've had an increase in pedestrian deaths, for example, and other things. So I wonder if there's a possibility to do a quick data refresh, mostly just to say this is still a problem. Because I anticipate, for example, that it's still going to be true that most of the state-owned roads in Midtown intersections are the most dangerous places and mid-block. But just I wonder if you guys have had that conversation or what a kind of quick data refresh might look like.
Yeah, so through the chair, the AMAT safety plan was just completed and adopted, and it actually does a data refresh and looks at a lot of those corridors and has a lot of this analysis. So it is very similar to what the high entry network was for Vision Zero. So a lot of this work has been done and can be referenced and used, and won't have to just be completely like started over there. But doing planning is super important and valuable, and this I envision as a Vision Zero coordinator will help take a lot of that great work that's been done and be able to move to implementation.
Okay, that's really great to hear. Thanks.
So your colleague from DOT, I guess, has a
Okay,
question
yeah.
too.
Hi, Luke Boland, Central Region Pre-Construction here. Just wanted to add too that we're also having those discussions over at DOT. Actually, right before this meeting, I was meeting with the traffic safety engineer and brought up some of those numbers that you're talking about. So these are active conversations.
And DOT also has a highway safety improvement program and a staff in there and a new traffic and safety engineer who's very focused, Anna Brawley, on a lot of these. So there's a lot of movement, the complete streets policy that DOT is doing. So there's a lot that's going on right now. It's pretty exciting to be in the industry, in the field, seeing this happen.
Can I just clarify? So it's not Anna Brawley. I believe it's probably Anna Boson.
Anna Boson.
And I'm saying that only because I'm not moonlighting with DOT. Thanks.
Yeah, I was looking at you as I was saying it, and there's, yes, Anna Boson, 2 great advocates for safety on our roads. So I hope you don't mind being placed in company with Anna Boson. So let's move to the next slide. The Protected Bike Lane Pilot Project is also one of the areas that we are putting our staff resources into. This is a fairly big lift, but we're really excited about it. This summer, from middle to end of May, is when we anticipate an installation of the Protected Bike Lane Pilot Project on A Street and 6th Avenue, working very closely with DOT and Anna Boson. And the materials that we're looking at are actually in process of being shipped. They should be here by the end of the month, which is really exciting. We will be reusing some of the plastic posts and rubber curbs that had been used on Pine Street last summer. In addition, some new things we're going to be introducing are bike signals. So thank you, Assemblyman Revaland, for incorporating that into code. We are excited about our first installation there. There are also going to be numerous traffic signs. We're looking at ways to advise the public so that there are no turns on red across the bike lanes, and other notices that point out the contraflow aspect of the 2-way bike lanes. There will also be green pavement marking tape that we plan to lay down on the road at the driveways and through some of the intersections to highlight some of the crossing points for vehicles and bikes. There's ongoing outreach. There's a website, which there's a link there. If you go to the next page, please. some things that I want to emphasize, why are we doing this? This is an opportunity to test without doing permanent infrastructure investment. And so it's something that projects like this take years and years to get to. Having a pilot project has enabled us in less than a year to be getting stuff down on the road to see how it works. It also is giving us a more complete understanding of the benefits and impacts, especially as concerns are being raised. We have gotten a number of different concerns from citizens in the area, business owners in the area, trucking, people driving trucks, and that these are on some freight routes, concerns about some safety at certain intersections. So all these concerns that we're getting are really valuable to hear about. And as we go through this process as a research program, we are going to be analyzing it closely and monitoring it. And so it'll be great to see what materializes, how we can adapt for it, we can resolve it. And this is the chance to do that. So that's been my explanation as concerns get raised is we'll watch, we'll look, we'll see how it does. And this is not a permanent, and in fact, a success for the summer pilot does not mean a permanent installation. It means we'll seek funding for a third pilot, for a phase 3 of the pilot to look at the winter, because that has its own set of challenges with equipment and staffing and our winter challenges, as you know. And this has been a phenomenal way to strengthen our relationship with DOT. It's been a great opportunity.
Thank you. So Ms. Brawley has a question, but I have a quick comment before that, which is I hope this is successful. And then I hope we think beyond just a protected bike lane and we think about maybe separate transportation facilities for non-motorized. I think that, Ray, it's one thing to say you can travel with traffic, but what if we looked at shorter routes for non-motorized transportation and tried to use some of our existing trail infrastructure to create some connections? Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, thank you. This is a comment as well, but something I want to follow up on. So I was just at the American Planning Association conference with both hats on, my assembly hat and my planner hat. And a lot of it was focused on housing, but I had the opportunity to go on a tour with the Public Works Department and Planning Department of St. Paul, Minnesota. It was in Minneapolis or Twin Cities. They are also, I think, a little ahead of us on their journey toward things like protected bike lanes, but I got to see some of their work and I talked to them specifically about winter maintenance, and they've been testing out several things. I got to learn about different types of delineators, those little plastic things, how you bolt them in. So they had a lot of really great information. So I will follow up and connect you guys as well. But I'm really excited to kind of see, because they're, again, not far along in the way that the city of Minneapolis is. And so I think there's a lot of kind of ways we can learn from each other. And of course, they're also a winter city, at least when they get snow. So just wanted to share that and I'll follow up. Thank you. And happy to connect with the state DOT folks as well.
Mr. Constant, and then we're going to have to move on.
Yeah, two comments by Ms. Eltel about finding connections to the existing non-motorized paths that we have. I think it's a yes and proposition. My experience with the bike advocacy community is they demand and have a right to access safe use of our roads as well. And so it's like figuring out what the proper balance is between those two interests is where we get to a system that actually works.
All right. Did you have any more slides?
One last slide,
Okay, great.
and it actually speaks to some of what both you, Chair Zolotel, and Assemblymember Brawley spoke to, is learning from other people. We were able to have numerous international experiences in the month of February. Staff from our department at PM&E and DOT, as well as Assemblymember Zolotel, were able to go to Finland for a cycling urbanism masterclass. Had lots of good opportunities to learn some things. I just wanted to give you some quick key takeaways that have been shared by the staff. One, we have been promoting biking differently in Anchorage versus other parts like in Finland, where there has been more focused on transportation. Here it seems that winter cycling, if you think about Anchorage, has been more recreation. So just something to keep in mind as we think about our biking. It's amazing how many people I see driving with their bikes on their vehicles, going to the trails, which are phenomenal. And I was just thinking, you could bike there. Another thing was just different approaches. Getting to see them in person is different than looking at pictures. And so having those opportunities and those relationships are super important. And then also improved maintenance requires infrastructure that provides space for snow. So having more snow storage space incorporated into our designs are essential, really. And then I was able to go to Edmonton Winter Cycling Congress, which I would love to bring to Anchorage at a future date, where it was also focused a lot on how do we maintain our infrastructure. And one of the things that's really about continual improvement and investment, something that we have to just chip away at what we have in front of us and keep working at it, never give up, but always be making progress. And then also everybody has different challenges. Anchorage's challenges have been different than many other places this year. We have had way more snow. A lot of the places, Edmonton had basically no snow. They had one snowfall that had been maybe a foot, and that's all that they had. And then also the thing is we need to embrace winter, not remove it. So thinking about how do we really do that. So that was my signing report. Thanks for giving me a little bit extra time, a lot to cover.
Thank you. I'm up for embracing winter till April, and then I'm done. All right. Thank you so much. Now we'll turn to DOT for their report.
Good morning, Assembly. My name is Kirk Warren. I'm the Rabbit Warren, Chief of Maintenance and Operations for DOT. Our director, Sean Holland, wanted to pass out his apologies that he wasn't able to make it today. He asked me to give a quick presentation on how our winter operations went, some of the things that have happened in the legislature that may inform us on what we can do different next year. And then, as we all know, it's the beginning of pothole season. We've got to report a pothole link on our website. Anybody that has any issues with potholes, please feel free to direct them to our link if it's a state road, obviously. So our crews are out there daily. There's a lot of them, and we're doing our best. So I wanted to pass that on. So winter operations this year, we have been vitally and critically interested in expanding our snow haul locations that we can deposit snows. We see that as an underlying issue for some of our operations. The state of Alaska has one site that we can use, although we work with the municipality quite extensively and we can share sites. I think it's vitally important for the state of Alaska to try to expand our capabilities. And to that end, we've been looking at expanding our existing site, which is in the northeast quadrant of O'Malley and Minnesota, O'Malley and Old Seward. That's somewhat delayed due to the delay in the O'Malley to Diamond project. It was going to be part of that project. Luckily, immediately adjacent to that, on the west side of Old Seward Highway, we do and are working with Municipality Planning Department to permit that site, and that'll be an extension, in essence, of the existing site that we have. We're also looking on the north side of town. We're looking at any feasible option. We have some space between the VFW Highway and the Glen Highway. That is state land, will not be a large capital investment. We're looking at possibly getting that permitted. We work closely with Paul Van Landingham and the municipal department on the area at Mountain View Drive in Boniface. We've been looking at that. There's a small sliver of land in that location that's owned by the Department of Defense. And we'll be working with them and with the municipality on perhaps a better use of that land for us, for our use as well. Also, we will be looking at possibly, if the municipality does not renew their permit at the Northwood site, I'm on the understanding that municipality is looking at developing their own site immediately adjacent to the Northwood facility. If that's the case, we will probably be working with the international airport to put in a permit application to have us use that site for our snow haul operations. In the legislature this year, we were lucky enough, at least as it stands right now, we received a 6% increase bump to our operating funds for our snow winter operations for $1.2 million. If that survives the Senate, then we will receive that increase. We've also received in the governor's budget $915,000 for statewide contracting efforts for snow removal. That was just recently amended, add $500,000 to that. So we're up to $1.7 million to contract out for snow removal. A lot of that will be used obviously in the Anchorage area. It's a statewide appropriation, but we've talked to the commissioner and most likely the majority of that money is going to come to the Anchorage area. We have a report, there's legislative intent language that is due to the legislature on October 1st in draft form regarding our snow haul operations and how we intend to do that better this upcoming winter. The draft report is due on October 1st, and the final report will be due on December 15th. I imagine we'll be working closely with the municipality. There was language in there about working with the school district and emergency operations centers. So we'll be reaching out to Brad and his counterparts to make sure that we coordinate with them closely. Before I go any further, I'd like to introduce somebody in the audience. Mr. Casey Eliason is the new superintendent for the Anchorage district. All things maintenance and operations that you are aware of that come to your attention, Mr. Eliason will be tackling those issues with the leadership team at DOT. And I have nothing else. Oh, sorry. Yes. And happy to take any questions, Chair.
Yep, have a question from Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, thank you. And I was aware of the legislative appropriations, and that's exciting. I guess one question, how can the assembly be helpful with that? Should we send a letter, or, you know, what would you recommend? I know you guys are maybe not the ones who do the advocacy. And then the other question is, especially for, I think you said it was 1.2 million, is that correct?
That's correct.
So I assume that's to the South Central region, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, so what kind of assurance would we have that it would actually go to Anchorage? Because the South Central includes Matsu, Kenai, and then also portions of Bethel, I understand, for the airport.
So, but yes, we have a fairly extensive region. It does go to Bethel. There's a lot of outlying airports. It extends down to Seward. We've been actually tackling that issue with Sean and with the commissioner on how we allocate in our budget and how we kind of carve out that segment so that we can easily see this is the amount that we were spent last year, not due to any extraordinary circumstances. So if an emergency event were to happen, for example, that should not count against the $1.2 million that we receive. That would be its own emergency appropriation. So we're trying to develop the tools to make sure that there's transparency on that.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want the public to be aware that it is a regional appropriation. And so, and not to say that the other regions don't also deserve funding, but it should not be construed that it's all automatically going to Anchorage. Thanks.
Understood. Yeah, thank you.
All right. And Ms. Bronga.
I'm happy you mentioned potholes because I had a very lengthy conversation about potholes. And I do have the number for the Muni, which this was definitely a Muni issue. But it made me wonder, as in snow plowing, is there also a map that shows like we are in this sector working on potholes, something that I could pass along? I did leave a message on the hotline and for the Muni and didn't hear anything.
Yeah, thank you, Assemblyman, through the chair, or Assemblywoman, excuse me. We don't have anything real time on where crews are exactly at that spot. Certainly there's the road ownership mapping that we've got. So it would certainly delineate which road's a state road versus which road's a Muni road. That's not going to help for the day-to-day, where are the crews immediately. I will say that our Division of, make sure I get this right, it's DMIO, Division of Modernization and Innovation Office, are working on tools on vehicle tracking and things of that nature. We're working with the unions and others on how we can best implement those kinds of things. In the winter environment, it does things like plow up, plow down, when have the crews been at specific locations. That may be something, if we put it on our vehicles and the state equipment fleet is apropos to it, it'll be instrumental in helping in that. Yeah, you're welcome.
I don't see any other questions. Do you have anything else?
No, thank you.
And some other items here. Luke Boland, pre-construction engineer for DOT. Since we last had our quarterly meeting, we have received partial approval from Federal Highways on the statewide transportation improvement plan or program. And good news on that we continue to have access to those federal highway funds, which is kind of primary funding stream that DOT uses for projects and a lot of other activities. With that partial approval did come a list of tier 2 corrective action items that we have 6 months to address. Just want to let everybody know that we are making that a very high priority over at DOT, and our goal is to address those tier 2 comments well in advance of that 6-month deadline. Also, we had a great public comment period for the Seward to Glen Planning and Environmental Linkage Study, or PEL. Really appreciate everybody that took the time to either meet with DOT, provide written comments, and we'll be taking a lot of that input, refining the alternatives that were presented, doing additional modeling, cost estimating, a great deal of analysis on the alternatives, and we will be presenting that work here at a later date. So this is not the last opportunity for public input on this. And again, thank you everyone for the comment. It looks like Assemblymember Constant had a question.
But I'm in the queue first.
All right.
So I was at Community Council in Rogers Park this month, and they would like to know why the 36th Avenue interchange has been pulled out of the STIP. And unfortunately, the Dowell consultant wasn't the person to answer that. So I don't know if you could provide that so I could give them that information, because they're very curious as to why that's not happening.
Unfortunately, I don't have the reasoning why that is not in the STIP. I know that's a project that we've been working on here in the region, and so I'll have to get back to you on the reason behind that.
I would really appreciate that. Very curious minds would like to know. Mr. Constant?
Thanks. And just as the Assembly is quite swamped with work right now, I apologize. We didn't get in comments from the Assembly through resolution. We'd asked for that time. We just didn't have the bandwidth to get a draft done. So there probably will be some comments coming at some point, but we've had these opportunities, which are very welcome.
All right. Yeah, a couple other items here. So recently here, we opened bids for a repaving project on Elmore. If you guys have driven that stretch of road, the pavement's in pretty bad shape there. So excited to get that contract awarded here in the near future and see some repaving work here this summer on that one. We also have been having some internal discussions on urban safety corridors. I know that's been an item that we've talked about on this group. Our regional traffic safety engineer and our statewide traffic safety engineer have been coordinating on this one. And so anticipate additional conversations here in the future on that topic.
Question for Mr. Boland.
Thank you. So on the pavement preservation project in Tudor, I guess one thing I could use a little bit more information about is how those projects are prioritized and sort of what feedback from local policymakers do you guys take in when choosing those projects?
So when it comes to the pavement preservation program, it's a data-driven program where we look at 3 different metrics there. Rut, ride, and cracking, I think, are the 3 that we've got. And that's also analyzed over the rate of deterioration. So how fast is that road deteriorating? And historically, that has been that pavement preservation pot of money has been a regional allocation. So Central Region gets an allocation, Northern, South Coast, and the region has prioritized those based on the data that we have in place. The STIP that was recently partially approved has that as a statewide pot of money, and so that's no longer a regional allocation. We've got meetings upcoming on how that pot of money is going to be managed moving forward, but we're still looking at the same data that we've had before when it comes to that.
So that project, is it, from what I've heard, it's a pretty long stretch of Elmore. Is that eating up like most of that pavement preservation budget right now, or like what's future sequencing look like?
Sean, do you have maybe defer to?
Sure. Sean Baskey, the head of the design section for Department of Transportation. Elmore Road, it's resurfacing, I believe, from Abbott all the way over to the UAA, UMID area. So it passes through the Tudor intersection, but really it's just resurfacing the existing road. As far as the overall cost of the project, it's probably in the $10 to $20 million range. As an example, resurfacing Minnesota last year and finishing up this year, that was also in the $10 to $20 million range. The regional allocation for the entire pavement preservation portion of funding for the region prior to this year being included as a statewide pot is about 50 plus, just over 50 million. So we're really talking about resurfacing a small number of roadways across the entire region, going all the way out to Bethel, Seward. That includes all the highways and everything else.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Anything else?
Just wanted to say thanks to Brad for his report there on the protected bike lane pilot and the efforts that the teams have been working on that. Excited to see that get implemented, and similar to what Brad was saying, see a lot of possibilities for us to do similar type pilot projects here in the future. Great way to not invest a lot of money there, but get the real data of what that actually looks like. And I believe that covers what I have, unless anybody has any questions.
Any more questions? All right, you're out of the hot seats. Thank you. We'll invite up long-range transportation planning standing report, or sorry, long-range planning standing report, including an update on the long-range transportation strategy.
All right, thank you. Ryan Yo, Long Range Planning Manager for the Municipality of Anchorage. Long Range Planning is currently working on 5 transportation-related projects, and I'm just going to go ahead and give a very quick, brief overview of 3 of those projects. And then with me is Daniel McKenna Foster, a Senior Planner with Long Range Planning as well. The first project is the Spenard Corridor Parking Study, and if the Assembly recalls, this was a project that was allocated funding last year. And the planning department broke it into 2 phases. We have completed the first phase. And what was involved in the first phase was an online survey that was sent to parking users throughout the Spenard Corridor. And it was literally every resident property owner within the Spenard Corridor. So that was 5,666 mailers that were sent. The project team also distributed flyers for that survey to every business along the corridor as well, as trying to increase participation. That online survey was open for a total of 53 days from December 4th to January 26th. And we received a total of 289 responses, which is about 5%. But we're pretty happy with that 5%. We did get a lot of really good information from that. The project team also conducted an inventory of existing on-street and off-street parking facilities and a parking utilization study for a sample of commercial and multifamily properties in the study area. Planning staff is currently reviewing that final report, and we look forward to passing that on to the Assembly after our next Citizens Advisory Committee meeting, because we'd like the Citizens Advisory Committee to review that report as well and provide some feedback to the Assembly. And we anticipate that occurring in probably late May, and hopefully should get that report to the full Assembly sometime in June. We're currently looking at the scope of work for phase 2 of the project, but it's going to involve future parking utilization and identify potential parking management strategies. The other 2 projects I'll mention are sort of under the umbrella of what we're calling the right-of-way management study, which is broken into 2 projects, projects A and B. Project A is a snow and ice management study, and project B is a parking management study, more broadly applied to the Anchorage Bowl. We're currently in negotiations with the vendors for each contract, and we'll make that recommendation of award and send it to the Assembly for consideration and approval once that's completed. We anticipate that occurring within the next 4 to 6 weeks. Unfortunately, we're unable to name the vendors at this time, and the selection process for those vendors, unfortunately, has just been drawn out. We did have 2 members of the selection committee that had family emergencies that required extended absences. One of which was a back-to-back for one individual. So we just had a very difficult time getting everybody in the room at the same time to evaluate the proposals. Before I turn it over to Daniel, any questions on those first 3 projects?
Yep, Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, thanks for the updates. I guess I'm curious because if I remember correctly, the overall right-of-way management study, and I appreciate the discussion about breaking it into 2 and the difficulties with getting the vendor on board. That was something that I think came directly out of the 2022 ending parking minimums. I remember that being essentially funded at the same, I think it was during the same meeting actually as the budget. So I guess I'm just curious because I'm a little concerned that, we're now, almost 18 months later. And I understand the Spenard parking corridor was maybe a priority, but it's much more local in scale. And so I just wonder, is there a way to maybe flip those priorities essentially, or what was the decision to not pursue that kind of bigger one? Because what I'm concerned about is the Spenard one is so specific. And I understand there were some business owners, for example, who really pushed for that to be moved forward as a priority. But in terms of the scale, we really need to know kind of the bigger picture. How do we manage parking on our streets? How do we manage right of way? And I'm worried because we've already implemented the parking minimums, and we're also talking just generally about land use reforms. And so how can we move that forward or maybe expedite it in a way that we can get answers sooner? Because again, I'm worried that it hasn't kept pace with kind of these other changes, and it is something that we need to deal with. So I just wonder if there's kind of what that might look like.
Yeah, thank you, Assemblymember Brawley. It's the Spenard parking corridor study. We're fearful of losing momentum on that if we don't keep at it. So I don't necessarily want to pause that one. Largely with the right-of-way management study, it's just been working through the RFP process, and it really is a bit unfortunate that the selection process did take as long as it did. That really drug this out. Instead of it taking a matter of maybe a month, it's taken multiple months, and it's just an unfortunate due to the availability of the selection committee and unforeseen challenges. But we certainly do. We've got a very motivated vendor, if everything goes through, that is ready to jump on that project and work on it on quite an aggressive schedule. So I'm hopeful that there won't be much more in the way of delays, and that we should be able to get you some good information fairly quickly.
Okay, thanks. And I also acknowledge those are two different scales. So I guess I'm not saying we stop doing the Spenard one. I just want to acknowledge, that's a very small area versus this much bigger question. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions on these project updates? Okay, keep going.
This is Daniel McKenna Foster, Long Range Planning. I'll be talking about the Long Range Transportation Strategy, which has also been known as Long Range Transportation Plan. We can talk about that. And also the Downtown Streets Engineering Study, which is a project that came out of the Our Downtown Plan update. So it's sort of a second piece of that. Next slide, please. So far I'll start talking about the Long Range Transportation Strategy. We've had 3 working group meetings, a lot of one-on-ones with working group members, online survey of 180 people, open house, transportation fair, ski bike to work day, went to FCC and presented. Next step, we'll take what we got from the survey. We'll have a 4th working group meeting, write the final document. Then it'll go out for public comment, and then it'll go through the public process for approval. Next, please. So just in general, this project is really about looking at kind of public priorities for how the muni spends its money, not necessarily federal funds or state funds, including those, but sort of the muni making decisions about transportation on its own terms. And so just, as part of the project, we've been looking back through all these plans going back to 2000. And people have been talking about changes to the transportation system for a really long time. And it's just a question of have we actually made these happen? And you can go back and look at 2020 plan, Anchorage Pedestrian Plan from 2007, the 2035 MTP, Mountain View Plan, East Anchorage District Plan. A lot of people saying we'd like the streets to be different. We'd like transportation choices to be different. And so a lot of this strategy is sort of enshrining that and giving the sort of policy piece for when those decisions come up, when you're working on the capital improvement plan or some other pot of money, or encouraging, other entities that are working in the transportation infrastructure sort of sphere to look at this and say, this is what the people have consistently been saying is a priority. We'd like that the investments align with those priorities as well. Next slide, please. So I apologize, you can't really see the data on the screen. This is the results of the survey. All the survey data is on our website right now. If you go to Anchorage Long Range Transportation Strategy projects, you'll find this. You can look at the raw data, you can look at the charts and kind of look through it. Again, we had 180 responses. The survey was open for 2 months. And we got a lot of really interesting feedbacks and a lot of text as well, and all that's available for everybody to look at. So the main sort of areas that a lot of what we heard came down to were people are interested in maintaining existing infrastructure. They're interested in the muni providing transportation choices. They're interested in managing the right-of-way for public priorities. They're interested in engaging the public so people know about the projects that are happening. They're interested in implementing the adopted plans. Again, so as I mentioned, there's a lot of these plans have been talking about that, and people say we've been talking about this in these plans for a long time. We want to see that implemented. And then prioritizing sustainability was also mentioned. Next slide, please. And now onto the downtown streets engineering study. This came out of the Our Downtown Plan, which specifically called for this study. This isn't as much about projects as looking at what exists out there and what changes might be able to be done. So it's a lot of research about right-of-way ownership, management, what the lane widths look like. And so you'll see in these examples, it's sort of on the left is existing, on the right is potential. The size of the right-of-way didn't change, but is there a possibility to introduce a protected bike lane, to change the direction of traffic, to put in angled bike lanes, that sort of thing. So a lot of people said, what are the projects going to be? We say, this isn't about the projects yet. This is about setting the stage to figure out which projects are viable or not, which would take, changing the infrastructure, getting more infrastructure, reducing the infrastructure, that sort of thing. Next, please. And right now we're at the phase, we're doing a lot of stakeholder interviews. Last week we talked with ACDA and Easy Park, and also Third Avenue Radicals. And this has been a really interesting piece of it, because we're hearing from all these people what they see and experience about the streets. ACDA saying, we just put in $1 million of parking meters. We want to make sure that that investment isn't adversely affected by something that goes on. That's really helpful to know too, right? People talking about loading zones. Loading zone is curb space. That's municipal property. It can be managed in a certain way, but it's the kind of thing that is easy to forget about or leave by the wayside. One thing that was interesting, pretty much everyone we've talked to said we need to slow down the streets downtown. So we'll continue with these. We're talking with the Chamber, Downtown Partnership, and a number of others. And this is just the beginning to sort of hear from some of the biggest players. We're going to the Downtown Community Council as well about what the priorities are. So we know we're not missing anything, and we're looking at everything we can, gathering that data. Since Brad's here, I've also mentioned we're collaborating with them. It's great to look at the downtown bike pilot. So it's a really kind of good collaboration right now in a lot of this stuff, and looking critically at the streets and the needs, and really making sure that we hear everybody, we hear all the needs, and we're, whatever decisions we make, keep everybody's needs in mind. So next slide, please. I think that's it. Thank you. Any questions, I'd be glad to answer.
All right, Mr. Voland.
Thank you. I'm curious in, I guess, either of these studies, but more so the long-range transportation strategy. A while ago, we had that work session on the 2040 land use plan, and we looked at like how many of the implementation items have actually been addressed. How many of those action items have been implemented on what timelines. When you looked back at some of these previous studies, like the Mountain View neighborhood plan or the AMAPS non-motorized plan, as part of this, is there going to be any analysis of like what the remaining implementation action items are from those studies and what percentage of them have been implemented? And I think these are very important. I also think studies have to lead to action. And even with the downtown streets engineering study, I'm glad we're doing it, but I don't know what's like stopping us from slowing down the speeds on 5th and 6th. I think everybody says that we need to do that. And so study for the sake of study, I'm not like a huge supporter of, but studies that can lead to really well-informed action, I can really get behind. So did you look at any of that? Like what those remaining implementation action items from those previous studies were? Or is that part of in the scope of this?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Vaughan. Again, Daniel McKenna Foster, Long Range Planning. Yeah, in looking at that, so far we've been looking at anything that mentioned transportation, and a lot of them, it'll be a policy and says make it easier to walk or bike, and so that it's hard to tie that to whether it's been implemented or not. But there's other stuff. I mean, I was looking this morning, parts about transit supportive development. Anchorage 2020 says the overall intent is to create a city in which there will be more opportunity to live a less automobile dependent lifestyle. 2040 says in the transit supportive development, this plan supports an evolution of auto-oriented commercial corridors. It could affect design of streets. So a lot of what the strategy will be doing is hearing what the values are, and then really thinking about, and these what the targeted changes would be. I mean, one thing will probably be recommendations about changing the design criteria manual, which is the design of the streets, which hasn't been changed in, I think, since maybe 2016. And all these plans are calling for that. So I guess I'd say on the downtown or the strategy piece, there's a lot of, I think that's a good recommendation. We'll go back and tie that more tightly to actually trying to implement those. On the downtown streets engineering study, I will say that the downtown plan had a lot of sort of guidance for projects. And this study is really about making it possible to do those projects, which mostly are looking at directions, trying to make them two-way if it's possible, looking at maybe changing the parking it's possible. So we have a list of potential projects. We've been talking with Brad about this. And this is the piece where it is, okay, which of these projects can we do? And really, what is the time, right? Because, a big piece is ownership, right? A lot of people say, we got to slow it down. We know that that's what we've heard. We know that that's one of the things that the plan has guided us to do. And this plan now, when we do the research, we're saying, please do the research so we can figure out how we can do that. So yeah, they're not exactly in the street study, but there are sort of projects lined up that the study is supposed to tee those up so that they can be done. Because, usually it's like, let's do a project. Well, why don't we do a study first? This is the study to line it up to do those projects.
So I want to remind folks that the long-range transportation strategy came out of effort by Mr. Weddleton and I that we have to adopt a long-range transportation plan. And the only plan we ever had was the one created through AMATS. And it didn't necessarily, it was the MTP, Metropolitan Transportation Plan. See, I told you, you got to learn how to speak AMATS. And it didn't necessarily reflect all of our values or coincide with some of our other adopted plans, like the Climate Action Plan. We said, well, what about those things that aren't eligible for FHWA funding or other funding through the TIP? And so that's what's driving the long-range transportation strategy. And we had to change the name because there was a fear of confusion. The other thing I wanted to share, and it's just a caution, downtown street engineering study is fine. I don't want us to have to wait on action in the rest of town to see what happens in downtown, because Midtown is seeing very distinct challenges, particularly with non-motorized travelers' safety. We have a lot of collisions that are often fatal. And the response of, well, let's just see what comes out of the downtown study is very dissatisfying and very dissatisfying to my constituents. So I just wanted to raise that. I would like us to figure out how to say yes and. So anything else from Planning Department?
I think that's it.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. All right. One more standing report, Ms. Acton, public transportation.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for having me. This is our first attendance of the Transportation Committee, so this is really exciting. So I do want to give you a quick overview today, primarily about what's happening with People Mover. My name is Jamie Acton. I'm the Public Transportation Department. This one.
Check.
We will figure out the mic situation. Perfect. Thank you. I can now hear myself too. Okay, so the Public Transportation Department actually provides 3 different services. It's fixed route, the People Mover, paratransit, Anchor Rides, and then rideshare, which is operated by a contractor, Commute by Enterprise. So today I'm primarily just going to talk to you about what's going on with People Mover, but if I have more time at another meeting, I'm happy to dive into some of the other subjects. So couple project updates. We are in the middle/final stages of the Transit Center Site Selection Study. Many of you have probably heard bits and pieces about this. We have had a really heavy public involvement process, and we are down to 3 sites, down from 42. We initially looked at sites in Midtown, UMed, and downtown. There was some really stringent criteria of what the department would need to be able to move a transit center. So right now, the 3 sites that are being proposed are the current transit center, just right across the way, the ConocoPhillips parking lot, and then the Chinook parking lot on 3rd Avenue. So we are in the middle of an online open house. started April 3rd. It runs through May 3rd. And I'll just give you the URL so you can go check that out if you want any more information, or I'm happy to provide you with that at another time. It's www.anctransitcenter.com. And that runs through May 3rd. So we would love to hear your feedback on that.
I think you might just get some. Mr.
I
Constant.
know.
So I think that I saw some cost lines to each of these proposals. One was like tens of millions of dollars. One was like just 3 tens of millions of dollars or so. And then one was less than $1 million. Doesn't that practically limit everything?
It depends on what criteria you're looking at. So we looked at multiple criteria to be able to narrow down to the 3 sites. And so it includes like additional development opportunities. It looks at the department's ability to expand transit services. And so it's really kind of driven by what's the ultimate goal for what transportation looks like in Anchorage.
So if a concept were to be selected that had a $30 or $90 million price tag, what's the reality of it? Speaking of plans that go to action versus plans that sit on a shelf.
So the Public Transportation Department actually has multiple avenues for funding that are, eligible pots that could help fund a capital project like moving and redeveloping and building a transit center. The Federal Transit Administration right now is developing programs and dedicating funds towards transit-oriented development. While we don't truly have transit-oriented development because we don't have heavy or light rail or bus rapid transit, we do still have opportunities to build things like mixed-use developments that would complement transit service. That could include housing, mixed use, office space, things like that. So we would tap into those federal funding sources to be able to build a new facility, but that would primarily be at either like an 80-20 match, federal 80, local 20, or potentially like a 90-10 match, depending on the funding source. So regardless, there would be local match required, which would probably come in the form of a bond for us to be able to do a development like this.
Thank you.
Thanks. You did mention just the old transit center being on that list. With that, I guess, could you tell us a little bit more about that? Because that's a curious result.
Yeah. So as many of you know, the Public Transportation Department does not own that building. We are tenants. We provide and pay a lease to ACDA. ACDA is looking at redeveloping the 6th Avenue garage and the surrounding area. And that redevelopment has been in process for many years. So that is not our project. We are excited for whatever development is to come in downtown. We are supporters of that, but we are ready and looking for a permanent home. So our current customer service space has been temporarily relocated for almost 3 years now. And so we are excited to get this process wrapped up and figure out what's going to happen next for us.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, thanks. And I appreciate the update on this. I haven't been following it closely, but I guess I wanted to, looking at the locations, a couple of them seem to contemplate the idea that the transit center is a central location. And I think in other cities, there's this idea of a transit plaza, or that it is like this, a space where you'd have commercial uses or that kind of thing. And then the one that's out proposed at the Chinook parking lot really puts it on the edge of the city and kind of almost makes it feel like it's segregating that use off. And I don't mean that with all of the baggage of that term, but separating that use off. I guess I just wonder how much that's been part of the conversation. Like, what is the vision for the transit plan, and how much does it incorporate things beyond just catching the bus, for example?
So one of the things that the Chinook lot kind of brings to light is the ability to develop it for multi-uses, and is the ability to tie in multi-modes. And so we've spoken to the regional carrier, Valley Transit. We've talked to, because if you see their service, they have one spot on the curb on the other side of the Conoco lot. They are growing and expanding their services. We've heard from the tour operators. They would like a dedicated spot so they're not kind of without a home throughout the summer months. We've heard, from the trolleys and different modes. It could look like a mobility hub and a mobility center that's tied to the railroad down the hill. There's just a lot of different options there that the current site, doesn't really account for or allow. I think that the Chinook lot looks at something like us being able to expand to like 23 bays. I'm sorry, I might be throwing, it's 20-ish bays. That's a dramatic increase in transit service. We can't do that really anywhere else right now in the city.
I guess I would just offer then, if it can be part of the description of the vision for that and how much of it is maybe creating a new anchor point, because what you're describing sounds like basically a bunch more buses, which I guess has the advantage of you're taking some of those buses out of the circulation of the direct city center, but it does make it harder and it kind of puts it further away. So just as you're doing that, just describing how much that would be an anchor with other uses beyond just a purely kind of transit mobility use. Thanks.
Definitely. I'll try to cruise through. I know you're short. Oh, go ahead. Chair. Okay. So I just want to talk about a couple other projects that we have going on during the second quarter. We have 15 new 40-foot buses that are anticipated to be delivered by late summer. Fun fact there, the Federal Transit Administration identifies the useful life of any asset that they help fund. And a 40-foot bus is intended to last or have a useful life for 500,000 miles or 15 years. So that's why you see the average age of our fleet right now being upwards of 12 years. Some of our oldest vehicles are from 2008. So these new vehicles really have some great efficiencies, and we're really excited to roll them out, not just for our operators, they're excited, but it's great for our passengers and the user experience. We have a service change scheduled coming up in May. We're looking at efficiencies, run times, and operator schedules. I don't anticipate any major changes to routes or anything like that at this time. And then we have several planning studies that are going to purchasing for the competitive process. Muldoon Transit Center, we received a grant from the FTA to look at actually setting up a transit center in the Muldoon area. We're going to look at a fare analysis study, and then we also have the Human Services Coordinated Transportation Plan that's coming due, and that is federally required for some of the funding that we receive for seniors and people with disabilities.
All right. Any questions? Mr. Martinez.
Thank you, Chair. Can you just give us a quick sense of the baseline funding formula for, does it matter? It used to be that butts and seats per mile was part of how the city receives federal dollars, the need usage formula of some sort. Can you just give us a quick understanding of how we do rely on some formula for federal dollars?
Sure, through the chair. We have multiple funding sources through FTA and FHWA. I believe the formula that you're probably referring to is the 5307 money, which is the urbanized area funds. And that formula does look at vehicle miles traveled. It looks at ridership. It looks at a multiple factors. It is also something that determines the split that we receive between the Alaska Railroad and then the municipality of Anchorage. With the bill that recently passed, the IIJA, that provided additional funding, I think billions of dollars across the United States, we did see an increase through that. It seems that the formula has been the same for many, many years, but it sounds potentially like there's temperature for that change to the formula to change over time. So that could be up for grabs.
Just to make sure I heard accurately, that there's a relationship between the formula for the urbanized area funds and the split with the state.
The Alaska Railroad, yes.
Correct. So that presumably our needs as they expand impact that split.
Correct.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
All right. Any other questions for public transit? Okay. I don't see any.
Good.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, we're going to do a little reverse here on the agenda just because Ms. Brawley is going to have to leave. So we're going to take up the Minnesota traffic divider, AKA the cheese grater, and resolution, and then we'll go to the right turn on red presentation. Ms. Brawley, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. And this will be a brief verbal update and then hopefully get a little bit of feedback. But first I'll start with a status update. So this conversation started basically when the so-called cheese grater was installed. And I know the neighborhoods around that area are not really happy with it. A lot of the public are. I will say some folks have said they like it and they really like the idea of being able to keep people from crossing for safety reasons. So it's not a universal hatred, I would say. But there's a lot of interest in could we, one, are there alternatives to change this one? And then two, could we have a proactive conversation with DOT before this type of intervention is used in other areas? Because I know not all of our streets even have two ways of traffic on the same street. You know, for example, the A and C couplet or the Ingra Gamble corridor don't have that problem because you don't have two directions of traffic on the same pavement. But for the place that does, it's Minnesota, or that part of Minnesota. So where we are right now, I believe it was a few months ago now. Of course, we've had other priorities. Myself and Member Voland and Vice Chair Zalatow have been working on a resolution. Two community councils passed resolutions, Spenard and Turnagain. Those were on our agenda as informational items at some point in the past. And they basically asked for a meeting with the community, with DOT and with assembly members to discuss this further and kind of understand how we could improve the design there and going forward. And so we have not, we don't have a specific update on that. We do have a resolution drafted. I would like a little bit of feedback from folks, if you have thoughts from members about what our specific asks should be. I mean, I think we'll certainly ask for a meeting, and I also recognize we have our DOT folks in the room and they were open to meeting, but whatever we end up putting in the resolution as far as our either recommendations or, you know, basically what would go in the therefore clauses. So that's really where we're at. And then once we get that written out, then you will see a resolution, probably not by tomorrow, but at a future meeting in the near future, we'll get that on the agenda. And then of course that would be the vehicle by which we could follow up. So that's my update. And then I don't have specific thoughts on what that should look like, but happy to take some notes. Thanks.
Thank you. I have Mr. Constant, myself, then Mr. Voland in the queue.
Thank you. I think that whatever resolves that we have in there, that we should provide at least two options, one being removal, better process, one being putting in a material that is less visually blocking, because that to me is the worst part about it. Is it just looks very Soviet. And you know, cheese grater is a fair description, and it just could be better, even if it has to function in the same way. It doesn't have to look so bleak and terrible. And so we would like a solution that meets the community's request. If not that, then at least a moderation of it that doesn't set a pattern in this town that we're just going to start setting up visual barricades for expedience and not for effect only.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. My quick comment is when I learned how this came to be through the Highway Safety Improvement Program, I was actually quite shocked. It was very different than the process I had experienced with several of my community councils. So any HSIP projects that have kind of moved through, particularly along the Tudor corridor, have always had someone coming, briefing us, telling us what the options are, hearing about community concerns, and then letting us know about what was likely to take place before it actually took place, whether it was lighting upgrades or something else. And so that's why I got involved in this. It seemed that this process broke down a little bit, perhaps, and if we could reset the process, then maybe we don't get that kind of surprise in the end. So, Mr. Voland.
Thank you. You know, I think this is a timely conversation, especially because on TIP Amendment number 2, there is an amendment to add a description to a project that was called Fifth Avenue, Concrete Street to Carlick Street, pedestrian improvements. And you think, oh, pedestrian improvements, that's a good thing, right? We all like pedestrian improvements. Well, the description that's being added is install pedestrian median barrier between Concrete Street and the couplet of 5th and 6th Avenues. So potentially there's another cheese grater coming to us soon downtown. So I think we really do need to have a conversation about whether this is a design intervention that we feel fits with the values of our municipality. And I guess on top of that, you know, if there are instances where we need to, I guess, in this, for the sake of safety or in the name of safety, to make things more difficult for pedestrians to cross, then what are we also doing in these designs to support active transportation? The Assembly has been repeatedly on the record strongly supportive of active transportation, so that folks can get wherever they need to go. If they're driving, if they're walking, rolling, whatever it is, they can choose. They have that transportation choice. So, you know, one of the things I think that's most glaring, to Member Constance's point about the Minnesota pedestrian divider wall, is not just the visual. I mean, it is very hard to see if you're in that inside lane to see what are the businesses on the other side of the street, but also there were not additional crosswalks put in. There was no sort of pedestrian supportive, you know, how are we accommodating or supporting folks who are not driving? You have to walk so long on Minnesota between crosswalks. It's just, nobody's going to do that. They're going to try to take these mid-block crossings that are more dangerous for everyone. So anyway, I just think that's the other part of that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, Mr. Martinez.
Yeah, I'll just throw in an additional comment. We often hear challenges of who's responsible for what particular area on a state road or a sidewalk, and I'm thinking of the amount of resources it takes to strong arm essentially communities with capital improvements of this type. That could be cooler. It could be cooler. It could look more creative in the first place. But aside from that, sidewalks on state roads are pretty horrible. And aside from them not even existing, they're not maintained. And so we want people to walk across the street. It was just mentioned, you know, what are the additional items that can be added when we consider a piece of infrastructure like this, like additional crosswalks? How about the crosswalks and the sidewalks we have today? How about stopping to point the finger to the municipality and who the other folks are, who's responsible, and just getting down to the bottom line that people have to walk in our community. And if you don't want them walking across certain roads, so you put up barriers, how about making sure that where they can walk is accessible today? That, to me, is not necessarily for any individual, but for the entire state to get it together, working with the municipality. Yeah, it's about time that we actually have the roads and the sidewalks that we have working for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, Mr. Johnson.
Mr. Constant, or all right. I certainly think I'd be happy to support something to, you know, come up with a better process or make a more visually appealing alternative to the cheese grater. But I will say, you know, I don't want to be entirely dismissive of the safety benefits of it, right? It is ugly, and certainly there should be more places to cross Minnesota. But having spent quite a few years driving through that intersection pretty regularly, it is dangerous. And I will say, for my part, it's been kind of nice not having to dodge pedestrians, you know, wandering in and out that particular section of the roadway. So I get there maybe some hard trade-offs there, but I will say I do think it's a little safer, even if it's unsightly, and maybe there's a way we can achieve both those goals, but I can't dismiss the safety aspect of it entirely.
Okay, gonna go to Mr. Constant, then myself, and then back to Ms. Brawley to wrap us up before we move on.
Thanks. And what comes to mind with that suggestion, and I don't disagree with you generally. I think there's some merit to what your comment was. If you look at the highway off-ramp at Muldoon that enters into the Tecotney area, first there's a fence, and then there's a bigger fence, and then there's a bigger fence, and only one of them has any aesthetic value. It's the one that has the texture on it, and it's the functional one. Everything else, people just cut through and figured out their way to get around. And so in some ways we could build up and build up and build up. I mean, if the idea on 5th and 6th is just to throw up a 6-foot wall so that people don't kind of make any incursions, it's a pretty bad design concept because the road users, and whether they're pedestrian or vehicle, are going to use the design that's available. And so I just use Tudor, the highway in Muldoon as a cautionary tale about fences on fences on fences to achieve the same goal.
Thank you. So the comment I was going to make is people are going to travel in the way that's most convenient for them and the way they feel most safe. I noticed that I cross mid-road all the time because it's available and it's convenient and right. And you're just going to do it if you can do so safely. It was part of the policy decision this body made to eliminate jaywalking tickets. And so I think we need to keep that in mind because I don't know that that behavior necessarily changes all that much. Even if the speed and capacity of the road is necessarily increased, they're still going to make those individual judgments on what works for them. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Ms. Brawley to wrap up this part of the conversation. I have the feeling we could possibly add a pedestrian safety or a non-motorized safety item for our next quarter as we want to kind of have more of this kind of policy discussion and ways we want to dig in. Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, thank you. Just very briefly, I appreciate the comments. I took notes. So I will circulate those into this resolution and get the co-sponsors on board, and then you'll see that soon. I forgot to say this earlier. I'll acknowledge also DOT staff have said in the past, there's the fence portion, what we're calling the cheese grater, and then there's that wall, the concrete portion. And my understanding that does need to exist because it is the footings for the larger lighting that was installed. So just to say, we understand the practicalities of that as well. So the issue is that there's the wall and the fence. As far as the crosswalks, I appreciate Mr. Martinez bringing that up because I actually used that intersection. I went through all 4 legal and non-legal crossings. So I guess I'll say acknowledge that I did that. But what I noticed was this was in the middle of winter. On both sides of crossing Minnesota itself, there were unplowed medians. So there was basically a pile of snow. And so unless you had pretty good walking and you had good footing, you had to walk through the snow. So if you were trying to navigate on wheels in any way, that was not going to be very feasible. Those were what you were supposed to do legally. The portion where there is no legal crossing right now was completely bare pavement, because it was, basically cars driving through there all the time. And so that was actually, if you looked at the intersection, you didn't look at the crossings themselves, and you said, which of these segments do I want to cross? That bare pavement looked like the safest one and the clearest one to me, even though that, again, that was not where you're supposed to cross. And then lastly, I'll just note, in our land use plan, that area is considered a neighborhood center, and there's language around encouraging pedestrian uses, neighborhood scale commercial, all of the things that you would want to see there. And so when we have things like these DOT installations, they work directly against our land use plan. So we want to continue this conversation. I just wanted to put those things on the record, and we will talk about this at another time. Thank you.
Really quick, Mr. Coughlin.
Structurally, I think next time we do this meeting, instead of inviting up DOT to sit in the hot seat for a report, I would love to have them up for the meeting. So that's just an ongoing, engaging conversation instead of what it's now, which is fine because it is what it is. But I think we could structure it next time to keep everyone at the table.
If they're willing, of course. All right. So with that, thank you, Ms. Brawley. I'm going to turn to Member Voland for his presentation, no right or left on red, except in the case of, never mind. All right, Mr. Voland.
And then you do the hokey pokey. Okay. So you all know I have an ordinance that proposes to prohibit right turns on red, what I'm calling the downtown slowdown. And, maybe also exploring the idea of left turn on red as well, where applicable. Next slide. So AO 2024-14 would ban turns on red lights, making it illegal to execute a turn when facing a steady red in the central business traffic district. That's downtown Anchorage. Reason for that, this is a measure aimed at pedestrian or vulnerable road user safety. When attempting to turn on a red light, drivers naturally tend to focus in the direction of oncoming traffic to gauge when it is safe to enter the intersection. So they're looking at where the car is coming from. However, that pulls focus from where they're going to be turning and actually heading into that intersection and surrounding crosswalks. Next slide. So here's a map of the central business district. This includes about 45 intersections. The central business traffic district represents a concentration of every form of traffic, motorized and non-motorized. As the area already brings motorized traffic into close contact with vulnerable road users of every variety, this ordinance seeks to reduce the risk to vulnerable road users at crosswalks. As the central business traffic district hosts a significant amount of pedestrian traffic, especially during the summer months, right, when we have tourists here, this ordinance will require all vehicles stopped at a red light to remain stopped until the light changes green, and then they have the right of way to proceed. This change frees the driver to focus in the direction of travel and to be more aware of the vulnerable road users around them, as opposed to having to focus on oncoming traffic. Now, I do want to talk about some data that is specific to the central business district. The traffic department looked at 27 years. In the 27 years, there were 11 right turn on red and 10 left turn on red crashes in the central business traffic district that involved a vulnerable road user. 0 fatalities, and only 2 of those crashes resulted in major injuries. So I think the question is, when we evaluate benefit or risk, how many crashes are we willing to accept? And also thinking about goals of safety, but also high comfort for vulnerable road users. Next slide. So why the slowdown downtown? So this slide outlines 2 main reasons for a downtown slowdown: safety and economic impacts. We want to obviously do what we can, I think, holistically to confront the growing problem of pedestrian and vehicle collisions. And then also safer streets invite more people to spend time and money in the city we love. We've heard a lot of conversation about how we should have a downtown that's designed not just around cars, but around people. And for me, I want to explore what can we do to make, everyone from 8 to 80, whether you're 8 years old or 80 years old, safe. In my mind, downtown should be one of those places that is the safest and most comfortable for non-motorized users. Next slide. So yeah, that cultural shift, prioritizing people over cars. This is just kind of a smattering of headlines. There's been many recent headlines about pedestrian collisions. On average, 19 people die on Anchorage streets every year. 43% of these deaths are people walking or riding a bike. For every person killed, 150 are seriously injured. And a 2022 report found that those who die are disproportionately people of color. Indigenous people are killed at the highest rates of all measured ethnicities. Here's some additional notes based on the traffic department's 2021 annual traffic report. In 2021, there were 3,430 crashes in the municipality of Anchorage, and for every 37 crashes, 1 involved a pedestrian. Of those 3,430 crashes, 1,205 resulted in an injury or fatality. Pedestrian-involved collisions have a higher proportional rate of injuries and fatalities. In 2021, there were 92 total collisions involving pedestrians. Of those 92 crash incidents, 83 resulted in an injury or fatality. So that's 51 minor injury, 19 major injury, 13 fatal crashes in 2021. Concerningly, the crash analyses 3- and 5-year moving average data demonstrate that when compared to national averages, pedestrian injury and bicyclist injury rates in the municipality of Anchorage are approximately double. The data make it clear that Anchorage has a long way to go when it comes to making our infrastructure safer for non-motorized users. Next slide. Did we skip one? Okay, so I want to show folks this. I think this is really interesting. So in his report, Mr. Coy from our traffic director did talk about how we're starting our Vision Zero efforts again in the future. In the Vision Zero plan is mapped a high injury network. So if you look at this map, There are versions of it in the AMAT's non-motorized plan and in the Vision Zero plan. When it comes to downtown, this network includes the entirety of 5th and 6th in the Central Business Traffic District, as well as portions of A and C. But you'll see this map also captures parts of Midtown, East Anchorage. So I want to just kind of take a mental snapshot of this, because at the end of this presentation, I'm going to give maybe some alternate proposals or ideas that we could look at going forward. Next slide. We also talked about in this meeting about putting our plans to action, right? So here is a list of reports, recommendations that I think are supportive of pursuing this type of policy change. Not only does the Vision Zero plan talk about reducing risk to pedestrians, very interestingly, the 2040 Metropolitan Transportation Plan has a specific action item 2A-1. Explore removing right turn on red at select locations focused on the Vision Zero high injury network. So that map that I just showed you, right? Additionally, although it's not listed here on the slide, the recently adopted 2050 MTP plan, which is before Federal Highways Authority for approval right now, it also gives a similar implementation item with a slight language change. It says explore removing right turn on red at select locations with a focus on intersections with high crash rates. So just want to put out there that I'm not just kind of making this up out of thin air. We do have plans that say you should take a look at this and see what you want to do about it. And then, as has been discussed here at our meeting, the long-range transportation strategy and downtown streets engineering study are ongoing. Next slide. So why do we allow right on red anyway? The practice of making right turns on red lights was not always legal across the US. It was only in the 70s that the federal government encouraged states to allow this, primarily as an energy conservation measure during the oil crisis. However, research from 1984, which happens to be the year I was born, found that at intersections allowing right turns on red, crashes increased by 23%, pedestrian crashes went up by 60%, and cyclist crashes doubled. Recent studies have raised similar concerns. Researchers in Toronto found that drivers focused on finding gaps in oncoming traffic when making their right turns on red lights often resulted in drivers overlooking pedestrians to cross the road. My day job, as you all know, is that I'm an eye doctor, and one kind of the cool things in that study is they actually used eye tracking software to look at that. With a great deal of evidence proving the danger of allowing drivers to make right turns on red at traffic lights, a growing numbers of communities are restricting them. For several decades, New York City has banned right turns on red unless otherwise permitted by signage. So we do have some intersections here in Anchorage, right, that are already signed, no right turn on red. Well, they have the flip. It has to be signed in order to allow a right turn on red. In 2022, Washington, D.C. passed the Safer Streets Amendment Act, which prohibited right turn on red. And in 2023, Seattle, Washington created a policy ensuring that no turn on red is the default standard when traffic signals are replaced or modified. So as they update their traffic signals, they prohibit the right turn on red. So here's some keys to success. If we were going to do something like this, I think we really have to have a lot of public awareness. That's going to involve signage. So we're going to need a summary of economic effects to be paired with any ordinance that takes into account the signage cost. We also need enforcement. Laws are only good when they're enforced, right? So just want to make sure that, we're aware that there are multiple things that need to be addressed in order to make this have legs. Next slide. So here I kind of just want to put before you all different options and kind of, we can maybe get a pulse here, or it could maybe just be food for thought for the time being. My original proposal, as you all know and have seen in your assembly binders, was to prohibit sort of broadly within the central business traffic district. Here I have that listed as option 2. Option 1, I'll go back, is do nothing. We could just keep it as it is for now, and you all could say, throw this in the garbage. Let's try another approach. Option 2 would be confined to the central business traffic district. I think that that has sort of pros and cons. One of the pros, I think, is that people readily understand what the central business traffic district is. They know when they're downtown. Oh, I'm downtown. I can't take a right turn on red. I think that's kind of easy to conceptualize. But I guess the con would be maybe doing that broadly across downtown is not addressing those intersections specifically that have the highest crash rates, right? Option number 3 would be we could tailor it to the high injury network, again, found in the AMATS non-motorized plan and the Vision Zero plan. And that would capture not only areas downtown, but streets in Midtown, East Anchorage, et cetera. So a little bit more broad, but also targeted at the same time. Option number 4 would be maybe the most radical option. We could just do this area wide. If you're in Anchorage, no right turn on red. And so, yeah, I guess I'm interested in what we can do as policymakers. Much like our conversations around housing, where we say, okay, we're going to use this tool of zoning or this tool of parking or this tool of tax abatement. We know that no one piece of the puzzle is the silver bullet or is going to address pedestrian safety. We have to take a holistic approach, but, interested in what we can do as policymakers on this body, working with the administration, various departments to truly make things better. Because I think, again, having those 3 and 5 year moving averages double the national average, we do have a problem. We have a problem here in Anchorage and in Alaska with pedestrian safety. So I'm interested in exploring what we can do to solve that problem. And next slide is just a thank you. Oh, I guess there's options to give testimony, but there you go. Thank you.
All right. So I'm going to open up the queue here. I myself, Ms. Bronga, any other initial takers? Okay. So I have 2 questions that may not have answers today. If you don't have that third leg of the stool enforcement, have there been any studies done that just indicate what the effectiveness of the intervention is anyway? Most people don't knowingly want to break the law, don't break the law, but without enforcement, is it still effective? And 2, in that suite of options to increase everyone's safety, where does this fall against other interventions like lowering speed limits? I don't know. I don't have a lot of knowledge about where those things go. And I hope Mr. Coy is kind of hearing these as well, because, Ray, I hope we can come back. I'm glad you presented at the committee. I'm hoping we can have a work session prior to it coming back to kind of now start to hone in on kind of the specific questions that remain to be answered. Ms. Bronga.
Hey, so I was trying to pay attention to this since I heard about it, and I was on F Street, going to take a right by the PAC. And what I noticed is there were a lot of pedestrians wanting to cross over to the PAC. And I was waiting for the light to turn green to go right. And I'm wondering, how much that's going to back things up, because when the light turned green, then I had to wait for a very large group of pedestrians, which I'm happy to, because I love those kind of people. But it was backing things up if I didn't do the right on red. So I just experimented with not doing the right on red there. And I wonder, did you have any data on that? How much it causes competition? I mean, there are some aggressive drivers that like, oh man, I've been waiting a whole cycle and now there's all these pedestrians. I can just picture some road rage.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Interestingly, when I presented this to the Downtown Community Council, full disclosure, most of the feedback was option 1, do nothing, which I thought was interesting, but they did have ideas for other interventions that they wanted to see. So one of their big feedback things was just slow the traffic down on 5th and 6th, lower the speed limits. And so I guess, I don't know, for me, it's like, okay, well, if this slows traffic, is it kind of getting at that same goal in a way, possibly? To your second piece there about the aggressive drivers, yeah, I mean, we'd have to do, I think, some type of public awareness, education, getting the word out there so people aren't honking when somebody's not turning a right. But also the expectation again is that these would all be signed. Yeah, appreciate that.
Thank you. Mr. Martinez.
Thank you, Chair. I'll just highlight maybe one question, and it's probably for Brad or someone else, but they don't necessarily have to answer it now, but it'll be a question that I think we need answered for any public engagement on this is, how do we determine where these don't turn signs go now? And what is the process of determining that? Is it just haphazard? Is it based on data analysis of some sort? Traffic flows and et cetera. So if Mr. Coy wants to come, that would be helpful too. Just quickly, how do we determine that now? Because we use those in fact today.
Yeah, correct. So Brad Coy, municipal traffic engineer, through the chair. We have the ability at any intersection around Anchorage to restrict turns on red at the moment. So that is within my responsibility as municipal traffic engineer. The way that we have been doing it, and we have about 10 or so locations where we've done it, is through a right arrow that's red. So if it's an arrow and not a ball and it's red, the code is that you are not allowed to turn right on that arrow. So just FYI, if you're out there driving, just pay attention. If it's an arrow, you shouldn't be turning red, whether or not it's signed. A few of the things. One is the main one is sight distance. So if you can't see, like an example would be 15th and Cordova, where you've got the hill right there. And so traffic is coming up that hill and might not be able to see that traffic. And so when they have the green, we don't want anybody else turning right and having an issue there. Or L and 13th has that same situation. So that's one. Another is 6th and E. That's right by the JCPenney parking lot. You can't see because of the building, so it's a sight distance issue. You've got traffic that might be trying to go up the ramp into JCPenney parking lot. So that's a sight distance issue. So most of it's like that sight distance. 7th and E has them because they're on the side streets or set back. So on 7th Avenue, east and westbound, you can't turn right or left onto E because to not encroach on the crosswalk and to not have, and because of some of the visibility, to not have the vehicles there blocking where pedestrians are. A and Benson has one because of the pedestrian activity. So
yeah, you don't have to run through all of them.
Sorry.
But I feel like you can. What I would say is what I'm hearing is that we do have, and you have the power based on a series of factors and criteria to make those determinations in real time, essentially. And we utilize those in different ways at different spaces, depending on the data that we're collecting.
Correct. Sorry.
No. I appreciate that. And so, no, you're off the hot seat. Then I would also just articulate to the sponsors. I think you mentioned the 70s with respect to traffic rules and the turns on the red. Idling and air quality was, I think, one of the issues. It was conservation and energy conservation was important, but idling and air quality in the corridors, you don't want people to idle. I think that's one of the other considerations that I would hope that we bring forward around anything that potentially has traffic stopped for any amount of time, especially in areas where we want traffic of pedestrians. Thank you.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that point. And I would be happy to look at how that was addressed in those jurisdictions that I mentioned. Interesting to think about that same concept in regards to drive-throughs.
All right, Mr. Constant.
Thanks, Mr. Martinez. You bringing up air quality. I didn't speak to this, but the previous discussion with the transit director, but the idea of expanding to 30 buses idling downtown raises similar concerns for me, considering I live within a mile of that site and plenty of people do. So that it's an important point to consider what happens when we try to streamline for transit purposes or transportation. What are the other impacts? Now, Daniel was careful again to express that the community council had some opposition. They were really strongly in the do nothing category. And I think I am too. But if I had to choose of the other three options, because the data is so spare on actual injuries relating to right-hand turns in the downtown, that there have been some injuries, no fatalities, and it's a 30-year track and it's less than one a year. The question of how many are we aiming for? We are aiming for 0. So there's logic there. But the high injury network, to me, is the most logical path of the choices, because it would limit it to the places where we know harm is happening. And so for me, that's a more logical connection, using the argument that, well, we need to reduce harm, than broadly for places we have no evidence of, narrowly to the places we do, and then over time maybe have a conversation. So I am persuadable in that way. If we're tailoring the policy decision to where the harm exists, and not creating a new policy that we don't generally enforce, people ignore, becomes a selective enforcement issue. Like, I could just go down all kinds of rabbit holes where it's not a great idea, but for where people are getting injured. I have a story in my mind right now of one of my constituents who witnessed an individual walking through the intersection of 15th and Ingra, and witnessed an individual in the street get hit by a car, and their legs went literally flying. And it turned out they were prosthetic legs. The person didn't die. It was a very dramatic scene. But we know that in that area, there are high impacts, and they're regular. And so to me, the logic is tie it to where the problem is.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I think I should probably also mention that I presented. It's just interesting to think about, like, every community council has its different flavor and priorities, right? When I presented this to the North Star Community Council, they were actually pretty supportive. And one of the things that I thought was interesting was there's a gentleman in that council who cycles a lot, and he had said, well, for me, it's the near misses. He's like, I've never been hit in a crosswalk downtown, but there's been many times where I almost was, and it scared me. And so how do we, I guess I'm interested in the safety and targeting, and actually, like, making those safety interventions, but also, like, supporting active transportation, making people want to choose active forms of transportation and not be scared to do so, right? And then the other layer that I forgot to mention is that in downtown, in the Central Business Traffic District, it's actually illegal to bike on the sidewalk. And we're piloting our first protected bike lane, which is awesome. But we don't have bicycle infrastructure. So right now we are in a situation where we force cyclists to share space with the road. So just another food for thought.
All right, thank you. Actually, Mr. Johnson, and then the queue, and he hasn't spoken. Mr. Johnson.
Yeah, thanks. And first off, Mr. Coy, I appreciate your comments on the factors you consider, right? I mean, because there's a lot that goes into, how the roads are designed and the things that impact pedestrian safety. And in contemplating this, I do find it somewhat intuitive to say, well, Central Business District seems like a reasonable place to restrict this because, there is a lot going on, and then the compromised sightlines. I don't know if you consider parked vehicles. I know they're not always right up to the curb, but with Alaskans and their giant trucks, it's often very hard to see around them until you're like halfway in the intersection. So I get all that. But where I'm kind of going with this is when we think about, what are the factors that lead to higher incidence of pedestrian injury, and look at the high injury network, we see, Northern Lights and Benson on there, and that doesn't surprise me. And certainly I think we should be looking at solutions here, but I'm wondering how much would restricting right turn on red make a difference on those two streets. They're both one ways, so already kind of half the directional traffic doesn't have the option. And then again, having driven down those roads pretty regularly, there's a lot of traffic through there, and it's moving very fast, and also, just being candid, there are a lot of people who cross those roads regularly who, we all jaywalk. I'll admit, I'll do it from time to time, but I usually look to see if there's cars coming. There are a lot of people on Northern Lights and Benson who I think are perfectly aware there are cars coming, but they're fairly indifferent to it, and they're just walking across it anyways, which is not to say, like, let's not worry about their safety. It's a problem. I can't tell you, as a law enforcement officer, how many people I stopped and had the conversation with, but, I'm not sure I worry about sort of misdiagnosing the problem in some of these. And so, like, if we actually want to make Northern Lights and Benson safer, which we should, maybe slowing them down would be far more I would imagine more impactful than restricting right turn on red. And I don't know if you have a take on in different areas, if we can point to, here are the specific things about this street from a traffic perspective that make it more dangerous for pedestrians? Because I imagine it varies depending on where we go.
So one thing we haven't done in a long time is get the traffic report when you put out the traffic report. And a big part of that and what we discuss usually is collisions, where they're occurring, what those factors might be. So that might be something we want to get back before us, because I know a new one came out. It's not that new, and there's always a lag, but I think that we could then use the data and that report to really help frame the conversation that I think I'm hearing is starting to come about. Mr. Littlefield.
I was going to wait my turn. After listening to Member Constance, opinion on the option number 3, I do like the option number 3 because it's where everybody's getting injured. However, nothing against the state of Alaska, but the sidewalks are an issue. We are a winter city. So I would focus the central CBD, because out of all the areas in Anchorage, it's the one that gets cleaned the fastest, and they always do the sidewalks. We have people taking care of it. So you're not going to have that. And I think Assemblymember Brala said you're going to have that pile of snow that they have to climb over. And sometimes it's so large, like this winter, that pile of snow is going to be bigger than a child trying to cross. So the CBD, if I was going to do anything and do a pilot program and then expand from that, I would focus on the CBD because it's more accessible and we can maintain it a lot easier in our winter city.
Thank you, Mr. Littlefield. Mr. Constant.
Yeah, thanks. And what I would add to that is I would constrain it in the central business district to the roads that are on the high injury network. That would be the most logical approach if you're trying to limit it. And I'll just say that it's instructive, Daniel, you bring up the North Star example. Like, as we are all well know in our work, every community council that isn't impacted by a proposal that sounds great, they're going to join and all for it, right? They're all for it. What a great idea. And so what I reminded about North Star is how difficult it was just to have an honest conversation about the protected bike lanes with the people in their neighborhood, which is the same principle, right? But then you had people that were willing to manipulate all process just to have their voice be the one that's heard. And so North Star is a really good example when downtown's very unified and they're like, don't do this to all of us. But North Star's like, yeah, let's do it. Like, that's one of the more common phenomena I experience in my community council work. The people up on Upper Hillside are happy to see a high density develop happen between Gamble and Ingra, right? It's this weird phenomenon. And so, but if we were to tailor it narrowly to as a test to the high injury network in the downtown, but I don't think that might make some of my friends in Midtown happy, because I think they might want to see some safety advances for their neighborhood, or a narrow decision to do it on certain paths in several areas within the high injury network, but not everywhere, just as a pilot. I think it gets to a point of logically reasonable and arguable against any base opposition, and just for being against.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. So I had a question. How often is the high injury network updated? Is it annual? Is it when traffic data comes out, and then is it reliant on old data or current data? So that's a question I have if we're going to rely on a high injury network. And I will underscore two things. One, I think, right, that why I've been working on urban safety corridors with DOT is, right, it gives us the opportunity to do some of these things on a pilot or limited basis. But to DOT's point, when I last met with them, they would like to be able to implement them statewide. Undertaking a statewide project for urban areas, which include parts of Fairbanks and other urban, is just a long road, pun intended. But I wonder if, this gives me some thought that as we think about urban safety corridors, like, what are all of the tools available so that they can be deployed as needed? But we have learned that actually more important than enforcement in the urban safety corridor down south toward Girdwood is education and then enforcement. So I would really be interested to see what the statement of economic effects for this to become effective, not just to exist, but to really start to produce what we're hoping it will produce. And for me, it needs to be data driven, but it also needs to be responsive to some community perception as well. Because along Tudor Road, there are just a ton of concerns. And so this proposal, which I don't think has hit Campbell Park or University Area Community Council yet, would likely be receptive as another tool to try to make Tudor Road safer, because Tudor Road continually, it has a very unsafe perception. And some of it's borne out, some of it's not, but it's like, yes, as Mr. Martinez signals, it's the whole thing. And what that perception does, though, is any new business that tries to go in along Tudor Road gets community opposition. It'll just bring more cars turning, doing something. We saw that with a couple of marijuana licenses. And it's like, well, no, they're actually zoned to be here. They're meant to be here. They have plans, but that perception of the road and its traffic and its conditions is then held against a business owner who has no control over that. And then that affects the economic vitality of that area that is very car centric. So I saw a hand, Mr. Martinez.
Yeah, just to go on to the point of the high injury network that you were describing, I appreciate the variables and the data as well. And I would really love to see the data, the nexus between where some of these accidents are happening on the high injury network and the reasons, the background reasons. One example would be, I don't want to miss the actual work that needs to be done because we are taking like legislative steps in a direction that seems right. And I'll give you an example. You could tell me if I'm wrong, but on Turpin and DeBar, there's a lot of car accidents in that corridor. Turpin and DeBar, Edwards, right in that little corridor. And a lot of really terrible car accidents as well. Cars just, I have a sense that there's a turn on the red that you can take as you're coming north on Turpin, and there's a lot of accidents that happen in that. Is it anecdotal? What I do know is that we can't see across the right-of-ways depending on what time of year, whether it's a snow berm, so people have to creep all the way out, or whether it's overgrown brush in the summertime. So I'm wondering about lines of sight, to your point, and our actual ability to maintain, because some have mentioned this before, what we currently have and the overlap between our lack of ability to do the right thing on maintenance and these accidents and these high injury networks. That I have some speculation that there's an overlap and there's a connection there, because if you can't see, you've mentioned before, that was one of the main criteria of when you would put a sign in. We know definitively that there are so many blind spots at different times of the year in our community. I would imagine that they contribute to some of the statistics that we're seeing. And maybe that overlay is something I don't want to make sure we're missing with respect to the investments that need to be made to do that work. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Martinez. I will turn the floor back over to Mr. Voland if you would like to wrap this section up, and then we will wrap the meeting.
Yeah, I appreciate the thoughtful feedback and questions, and I will get to work on exploring some of those. And I guess my last comment would be just for us to all to keep thinking about like our role as the policymakers, right? We are very fortunate to have great engineers and people working in our various municipal departments who have a lot of expertise, but I think we also have a role when it comes to setting policy, creating policy, putting things in code, being the authors of the code. And I think sometimes those things run up against each other. There can be just an inherent rub, right, where people want to keep some of their autonomy over decision making. For better or for worse. And so just, I guess I'm interested in what steps can we take as policymakers to make a better situation here in Anchorage, while also being reflective to the input of our experts. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Voland. All right, legislative priorities and budget items. We are in our first quarter budget revisions. So we'll just keep that to Friday's conversation, as you all are reminded to bring your amendments. Legislative priorities. I hope that you took a look at the email that Claire sent around today. It detailed what's in the budget and not in the budget. And so if you were looking particularly at a capital project, you should look to see if it's there. And if it's not, maybe reach out to your cohort at the Senate or House side and see what you can do about that. Or if it is there, perhaps reach out to your cohorts and see what you can do to preserve it. So I will make sure, Mr. Littlefield, that we get you a copy of that email. It had a really great rundown. Thanks. With that, any audience participation? Oh, sorry, Ms. Bronca.
I really feel badly about the Madeline and Patterson project. And I'm hoping you're with the state, correct? Or I know there's a channelization project on Tudor Road, and I hope that you get to the community council and let them take a look at it, because I don't want anything like that to happen again. Thanks.
Okay. Anyone here to participate from the audience? Anyone at all? All right. With that, we will be adjourned and we'll see you in another quarter. Thanks so much.